Assessing Revolutionary and Insurgent Strategies. Threshold of Violence. Paul J. Tompkins, Jr., USASOC Project Lead. Guillermo Pinchuk, Lead Author, Editor. Chris Kurowski, Contributing Author. United States Army Special Operations Command and the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Introduction. Various authors have noted that violence is often a double-edged sword within combat settings, particularly those involving a resistance movement fighting an asymmetric conflict against the security forces of a stronger incumbent government, with both sides vying for the sympathies of a local population. Michael Atkinson and Moshe Kress, in their article on Popular Response to Violence During Insurgencies, noted that on the one hand, violence is needed to fight the other side and perhaps deter individuals in the population from supporting the other side. But on the other hand, it can turn the population against the source of that violence. This tension is captured more formally in the equivalent response model originally developed by Dr. Gordon McCormick of the Naval Postgraduate School and elaborated by Eric Wendt in his article on Strategic Counterinsurgency Modeling. Wendt noted that with respect to the use of violence by resistance movements that seek the overthrow of a targeted government, such groups sometimes start small and may follow a certain trajectory in their formative stages. Initially, a group may be capable of only small-scale resistance or violent actions, and if it remains in existence, it may add covert and small-scale guerrilla actions to its repertoire as it grows to potentially culminate with its adoption of conventional tactics. A canonical example is given by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, which eventually started out in the late 1970s with small-scale attacks in northern Sri Lanka, which was followed by the group's widespread use of irregular tactics in the early 1980s and culminated with its graduation to conventional tactics against the Sri Lankan government beginning in the 1990s. Wendt noted that regardless of the length of a resistance movement's gestation period, it must grow in size to become capable of challenging an incumbent government, and to do so, it must become a judicious user of increasing levels of violence. At a minimum, a group must use a minimum level of violence to ensure its relevance and assist with mobilization efforts, and as a group grows in popularity over time, this minimum level may need to increase to ensure that the group's violent activities convey perceptions of strength commensurate with its enhanced status. However, excessive violence may be detrimental and self-defeating if it violates a community's norms surrounding legitimate levels and targets of violence, or if it brings a crippling counter-response from the government. It therefore follows that, with respect to the use of violence, resistance groups may need to operate within a band of excellence, in which the intensity of violence is maintained within minimum and maximum thresholds. The government also faces upper and lower thresholds of violence, and Wendt noted that for a government to maintain legitimacy and provide security to a host population, the intensity of its response might have to exceed the initial salvo of a resistance group. Hence, both an incumbent government and a resistance movement challenging the government's authority confront lower and upper thresholds of violence, where too little violence signals weakness and ineffectiveness, while excessive levels of violence risk alienating the host population. The fundamental dilemma, of course, is that the lower and upper thresholds of violence and their evolution over time are determined by a local population, and assessments of those levels and their evolution by insurgent or government decision-makers are highly subjective and error-prone. Speaking of the use of violence by the Irish Republican Army, IRA, John Darby, in his chapter on legitimate targets in the book New Perspectives on the Northern Ireland Conflict, noted, quote, "On the evidence of the IRA's use of legitimate targeting, its denials of unwanted casualties, its exclusion of certain groups from attack, and its care to anticipate internal criticism, it is clear that the IRA is aware of the limits of its own community's tolerance. The need to maintain the tolerance has been a major restraint on its escalation of its campaign of violence towards a more genocidal, indiscriminate slaughter. The instruments for measuring the community's toleration are not precise ones. The limits are often defined only when they are breached, and the community indicates, by the means of communication at its disposal, that the violence has gone too far." End quote. A number of recent examples illuminate violations of the threshold of violence, in particular the upper threshold. For instance, in July 2005, Ayman al-Zawahiri, then second in command of al-Qaeda, wrote a letter to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a prominent Islamic militant in Iraq, criticizing the latter's reliance on attacks on Iraqi civilians and use of gruesome methods to kill hostages. The al-Qaeda leader realized that such gratuitous displays of violence had alienated Muslim public opinion, thereby threatening the achievement of the group's strategic goals to remove the United States from the Middle East and reestablish the caliphate. Interestingly, violations of the upper threshold need not be normative. They may come in the form of infringements on the interests of powerful political, economic, and social elites. More specifically, violence and associated activities may endow groups with political influence that cuts against the interests of local elites, who may then seek to mobilize the local population against the initiating group that is using violence to upend local hierarchies. An example is the decision by Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq's Anbar province to break with al-Qaeda and side with the United States beginning in 2005. As John McCary stated in a Washington Quarterly article titled "The Anbar Awakening, an Alliance of Incentives," quote, "Although media coverage and analysis has focused heavily on al-Qaeda's campaign of violent coercion and the supposed improved efficacy of the U.S. military after the arrival of the surge brigades, testimony from Iraqis themselves and U.S. military commanders on the ground tells a different story of why the sheiks chose to change sides. It was not the grotesqueness of the violence perpetrated by al-Qaeda which caused the change, for Iraq and al-Anbar have a long, storied history of using violence for political ends. Rather, there appear to be two main factors: the Sunni tribal sheiks' own changing perception of al-Qaeda's threat to their continued hold on power, and the developing U.S. military approach in al-Anbar. Initially, the major threat to the sheiks was the U.S. military and its imposition of martial law, democratic processes, and the support of the new Iraqi government based in Baghdad as the locus of power for the country. All of these elements undermined their traditional position of power in the region and disrupted their ability to control their tribesmen. Later, the sheiks began to face a similar threat from al-Qaeda itself, which increasingly asserted control in the region through money and violence, but also posed a clear and real mortal threat to the leaders themselves. Eventually, Sunni tribal leaders in Anbar province deemed al-Qaeda's influence as more of a threat to their continued rule, while U.S. forces were considered to be less and less of a determining factor in the region. End quote. Hence, Sunni tribal sheiks in Anbar began to see al-Qaeda as its primary long-term threat rather than the United States, with the presence in Iraq seen as temporary. Their reaction against al-Qaeda was based not on moral repulsion over the use of violence, but rather on the belief that increasing levels of jihadi violence enhanced the power and status of al-Qaeda in the province, which threatened the interests and lives of the sheiks themselves, who sat atop local political, economic, and social hierarchies. The relevant audiences whose opinions shape the threshold need not be restricted to a domestic population, but may also include foreign audiences. For instance, in the 1980s, the population of the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, which at the time consisted of approximately 50 million Tamils, sympathized with the plight of their ethnic brethren in Sri Lanka. The need for Tamil electoral support and to keep latent the desires for independence on the part of the Tamil population and elites in Tamil Nadu forced the Indian government to take a leading role in the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. However, the LTTE's assassination of Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in May 1991 proved deeply unpopular in Tamil Nadu. In this case, an insurgent movement's use of violence violated the norms of a foreign audience regarding the appropriateness of a target of a violent attack. Although not defeated until 2009, the LTTE apparently overplayed its hand with the assassination, which led to a sharp decrease in support from the Tamil population in Tamil Nadu. However, sometimes violations of the threshold may be fatal in the short run. In the late 1980s, the Janatha Vikmuthi Peramuna, JVP, the People's Liberation Front, a Marxist Sinhalese resistance movement in Sri Lanka, subjected that country to several years of economic sabotage, political assassinations, and insurgent violence in an effort to overthrow the government. Its activities created havoc throughout the Sinhalese areas of the country, and although it put significant pressure on the government, by mid-1989 it had not succeeded in its efforts to destroy it. Growing desperate, the JVP increased the lethality of its attacks on the one institution holding the country together, the armed forces. In early August 1989, it issued a threat over radio to the family members of armed forces personnel, threatening them with death unless their relatives in the armed forces ceased their campaign against the group. In response, a pro-regime paramilitary group, the Deshapremi Sinhala Tharuna Peramuna, Patriotic Sinhala Youth Front, issued the following chilling threat to relatives of suspected members of the JVP. Quote, "Dear father, mother, sister, we know that your son, brother, husband is engaged in brutal murder under the pretense of patriotism. Your son, brother, husband, the so-called patriot, has cruelly taken the lives of mothers like you, of sisters, of innocent little children. In addition, he has started killing the family members of the heroic Sinhalese soldiers who fought with the Tamil Tigers and sacrificed their lives in order to protect the motherland. Is it not among us, ourselves, the Sinhala people, that your son, brother, husband has launched the conflict in the name of patriotism? Is it then right that you who are the wife, mother, sister of this person who engages in inhuman murder, or your children, should be free to live? Is it not justified to put you to death? From this moment, you and all your family members must be ready to die. May you attain nirvana. Patriotic Sinhala Youth Front." End quote. This move proved fatal, as the armed forces stepped up a pre-existing unconventional campaign against the JVP. The campaign resulted in the final decimation of the group, with much of its leadership and membership wiped out by the end of the year. As can be seen in these examples, the threshold of violence, in particular the upper threshold, is a highly salient issue affecting insurgent groups, incumbent governments, and concerned publics. This report analyzes how violent resistance movements manage the upper threshold. In particular, it focuses on their decision-making regarding the use of violence in light of the threshold, and on their strategies to give themselves greater leeway to use violence by raising the upper threshold. Because the decision to use violence may be the outcome of a deliberative process that weighs the costs and benefits of different alternative, violent and nonviolent actions, we begin with a discussion of the applicability of a particular paradigm, rational choice theory, to help us understand the degree to which the decision to use violence is influenced by rationality and deliberate cost-benefit calculations. Following this discussion, we detail the benefits that may accrue to groups that use violence, including compelling concessions from incumbent governments and sending signals to different concerned audiences. Lastly, we discuss strategies groups employ to raise the upper threshold. Such strategies include provoking an indiscriminate government counter-response likely to foster anger and a greater tolerance of insurgent violence among a population, the provision of public goods and social welfare by a violent resistance movement to gain popular support, and the use of narratives to help define community standards regarding legitimate acts of violence. Although much of the discussion centers around insights and examples consistent with the equivalent response model, in which a resistance movement confronts a government as both parties try to win the support of a host population, the discussion at times also considers violence used in other contexts, such as insurgent attacks on a population. Additionally, we include examples of how groups have attempted to or have succeeded in raising the upper threshold of violence.